Baldur's Gate 3 will not be coming to Game Pass, and Larian talks about why, and I'm going to look at their reasoning, but I also want to look at where Baldur's Gate 3 landed on the most played games on Xbox. You can actually go to Microsoft's website and see what the most played games are in order. There's also the top paid games that I want to look at as well and see what sort of an impact that not going on Game Pass may or may not have had on Baldur's Gate 3 landing on the Xbox. Now, the opening weekend of Baldur's Gate 3, I was interested to see what the reception would be like. That entire weekend, I checked the most played games list, and the top 50 games, Baldur's Gate 3 did not get on there until in sort of the middle of the following week, and then subsequently on the weekend we're going to be looking at where it's landed, and it has climbed significantly versus that opening weekend. Now, some of the reasoning behind that, I think, is because they really did not market this. They didn't really even announce it. It was supposed to be announced during the Game Awards, during Larian's acceptance speech, but he forgot. He said he was flustered. He has posted his entire acceptance speech online as well, because the valid criticism that those speeches were cut a little bit too short, to make for time for just a very, very jam-packed full Game Award ceremony. And, Jeff Keighley said they're going to give them more time in the future, and I think that's probably a good decision. However, I was not surprised to see that it got a slow start, because this is an interesting game to do a quote-unquote shadow drop on. You can't really shadow drop a game that is coming, but no one knew the exact date. They knew that Larian had sort of speculated, or not speculated, but scoped out and said it's going to be arriving in 2023 to Xbox, but that late arrival, I do think, probably hurt it. But I also think what probably hurt its performance that opening weekend is just there just wasn't any marketing, and to shadow drop something people had been kind of waiting on. I think word of mouth is why it's suddenly climbing, because we know the caliber and the quality of this game. It is Game of the Year, and I think that's probably why it is suddenly doing so well. And this is sort of going against some of the conventional wisdom that it's difficult to have success on the Xbox platform if you don't go on Game Pass, because it's just hard to get your game in front of people. Microsoft sets it up. They really want to put that Game Pass out in front of people, which makes perfectly good sense. That's their main value offering to so many of their customers, and they don't want to sort of, overshadow that. I also think it's a tough spot to be in. You really sell that value to the customer. It's amazing. There's tons of games to play. I've been recommending RoboQuest to people. It's a great little rogue on there on Game Pass. But once you get people accustomed to that value, if a game doesn't land on Game Pass, well, then they might say, well, I'm not interested in it. I see people saying this about games like Diablo and others. They're like, well, I'll wait for it to come to Game Pass. And it'll be interesting to see, now that Microsoft owns such big property, will they be putting everything on Game Pass as they always have, or will there be sort of maybe waiting periods? Will they be more selective with what they put there? Because Baldur's Gate 3, I think, is really showing that, hey, if the game's big and in demand, you can, potentially garner a whole lot of sales. And then when you have something as popular as Call of Duty and Diablo, I'll be interested to see, what their strategy is with those titles. I've continued to say I think they're going to throw those games on Game Pass because they can sell them elsewhere, and that's a great sort of double whammy. They can increase the value of Game Pass while also making money on other platforms like PlayStation. So let's look at this IGN article. What is Larian saying, and why, specifically with the reference of this not coming to Game Pass? So here's the quote that's further down. We made a big game, so I think there's a fair price to be paid for that. Now, I, for one, am fully in support of that posture and that attitude. I love when developers say, listen, we put a lot of work into this, we feel that the price tag is representative of that. I continue to think that we're sort of entering into not necessarily dangerous territory, but not the greatest place when the consumer thinks that video games are either easy to make or not expensive, or that they should be cheaper, when if you look at the history of games, they're so much more expensive to make now than they ever have been. You can go back and look at the size of the teams and the budgets that went into some of the most popular games, and that's not even close to what is spent and what goes into them. And I like when developers sort of hold firm on that, and they said, listen, there's a lot of work that goes into this, there's a lot of value, and what Larian has to say, I think, is pretty good. So it says here, Baldur's Gate 3 is now available on Xbox, but don't expect it on Game Pass anytime soon. Speaking with IGN as part of a sweeping spoiler-filled interview on the making of Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios founder Sven Vincke explained why the award-winning role-playing game won't be part of Xbox's subscription service. And here he says, we always said from the get-go, it wasn't going to be on Game Pass. It's not going to be on Game Pass, right? Venky said when asked whether Xbox had tried to pay the studio to put Baldur's Gate 3 on the surface. Now, that's one of the reasons that it's kind of tough to say no sometimes to Game Pass. You might maybe fault a developer for doing that, like, oh man, you shouldn't have done that. You should have held to your principles. But if Microsoft makes that big offer, it can be really hard to say no to that, because a lot of the times that money is sort of a surefire route to funding the next project, keeping the studio going. A lot of these smaller studios, that check can be very winsome. Now, we did cover recently, Devolver Digital indicated that the offers are getting smaller, maybe not quite as lucrative as they used to be. That's not surprising. Xbox owns a ton of property now, so they don't have to write nearly as large of a check to get those smaller AA or indie games on Game Pass, because they don't need them as much going forward. They can really add to the value of Game Pass with their own catalog of games like Call of Duty. Putting a lot of those past games on there, if they do that slowly over time, that really adds to the value. And then they're not writing all these big offers and checks to other companies. So continuing here, it said describing it as a sensitive question, Venky pointed out that Larian Studios is in the business of, quote, making a game that has a beginning, middle, and an end. He also touted Baldur's Gate 3, their lack of microtransactions, which has been praised in some quarters. So here's that quote here. We made a big game, so I think there's a fair price to be paid for that, and I think that is okay. We don't charge you any microtransactions on top of it, so you get what you pay for. Up front, it's a big, meaty game, so I think that should be able to exist as it is. This is what allows us to continue making other games. And I do think that not every game can necessarily say this, like, hey, there's no microtransactions, or hey, what you're paying for our game, you're getting way more than other games. Now, he doesn't say that, but I'll say it. I mean, a lot of the times you buy games, you're not going to get these kind of hours. I mean, look at this data here. It says, according to IGN sister site How Long to Beat, a completionist run in Baldur's Gate 3 can take upwards of 144 hours. Many fans are even playing through Baldur's Gate 3 multiple times as they try unique routes like the Dark Urge. And I think that's what gets so, hard to quantify in gaming, is that every game is of a different length. One game, you could beat it in 20 hours, and you really felt like it was amazing, and a ton of work went into it, but you're not going to get 144, right? And so I don't necessarily think you can only price a game based on its size, or based on its completion length, or based on how many replays you can get out of it, because it really does come down to the value that the consumer sees they're getting in conjunction with the cost that goes into the actual development of the project. Some of these bigger AAA titles, your campaign's going to last 20 to 25 hours, and the budget that went into that was insane, right? Maybe they have big-name celebrity actors. Maybe they did a ton of motion capture. Maybe they have an amazing original score that had to, they paid some famous composer to make. There's just a lot that goes in that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see that in the playtime. But Baldur's Gate 3 is certainly one of those games that can say, look, man, our game's massive. And I also think this game in particular, with how dense it is and how I think it is hard for people to get into a game like this if they're not accustomed to it, I don't think it would have been served well by Game Pass. I think a lot of people would have tried it on Game Pass and kind of threw it over their shoulder and said, this game's not for me. We kind of saw that with Lies of P. Lies of P is a really challenging game. It didn't get the greatest score on the Xbox platform, which is interesting because you would think that it'd be more favored over there because it was a Game Pass game and, people had to buy it elsewhere. But when the game is really challenging and really difficult, you're probably going to give it a little bit more time before, walking away from it, because you can't refund games on consoles all that easily, and even if you do, they only let you do it every so often. So I do think that Game Pass could have potentially hurt the reception of Baldur's Gate 3, and here's why. We've seen this happen on Steam, where if a game comes out in the opening days, it gets really bad scores, it murders the sales of the game. We saw this in a very exaggerated instance with The Day Before. It sold literally no copies the second day because the game was fake, it was a total scam, and it had like a 19% on Steam. Well, once your score drops that low, you're not going to sell very well. Well, you don't want to have a game like Baldur's Gate 3 that might be tough for some people to get into, having its score get lowered in those initial days by people that are just kind of trying it out and then saying, oh, this game's bad or this game's trash or I don't understand it or whatever. And then people that might be considering buying it, there are a lot of customers in the Xbox ecosystem that don't have Game Pass. Well, they're going to go to buy it and they're going to see that low score and they might be disincentivized from buying the game. And this is something that game developers and publishers have got to consider when considering whether or not they go on Game Pass, because it can potentially hurt your sales. And I do think that some people have looked at it and called it value destructive. The guys from Take-Two said that. Jim Ryan was, famous for saying this during the FTC trial, that he has spoken to developers, or all the publishers that he's spoken to. They think it's value destructive. And I do think Game Pass is going to be in a more unique position going forward to lean a little bit more heavily on Microsoft's first-party owned property, as opposed to constantly having to go out there and grab third-party deals, and third-party contracts. And I do think Baldur's Gate 3 is a great indicator that if the IP's big, famous, and in demand enough, it won't hurt it. And so I want to show you where it's falling right now on most played. So this is the official Xbox or Microsoft website. You can just go search Xbox most played games and you'll see this list. Now, I have always said that the first 6 spots are almost impossible to count because you're talking about Fortnite. The Lego Fortnite mode is just exploding. Call of Duty, Roblox, Rainbow Six Siege, Grand Theft Auto, NBA. So these first 6 slots is like, come on, that just isn't really even fair. I would even say the first 9 because you got Apex and Grand Theft Auto Online up here. Like, those are tough games to have more players than, right? So these are your first 9 slots, and then when you get to number 12, there's Baldur's Gate 3. Now, again, I think it would have done better its opening weekend, where I couldn't find it on this list because there just wasn't that marketing push. There was not a lot of advertisements. I didn't see any big announcement or any push. A couple of tweets here and there. The way that it came to the platform was really unique, right? It was a late arrival because they couldn't get split screen to work on the Series S, and they just finally decided just to launch it without it. I doubt that split screen will ever come to Series S. As far as I can tell, Larian's open to it or looking into it, but I don't have a lot of confidence that that's ever going to happen. Split screen, more than likely, and this isn't just pertaining to the Series S, I think split screen going forward might be more rare when a game has a lot of really high fidelity graphics or a lot of moving parts or a lot of things going on. That makes it really, really difficult. I mean, these consoles are great, but they're still, going to struggle with that, unless of course it's a game like It Takes Two or something where it's built for a split screen from the ground up. So I think it's great to see it climb like this on the Xbox platform to the 12th spot. I mean, you're right behind Destiny 2, which Destiny 2 isn't in the greatest spot right now. But the cool thing about Destiny is you can use the Charlemagne bot to see how many people are playing. And the one day we checked this, Baldur's Gate was right here with Destiny 2. And at the time, Destiny 2 had like 200,000 people playing on Xbox. That's an impressive amount of people to be playing Baldur's Gate on one platform alone. And the pattern kind of follows what happened on Steam. Baldur's Gate opening weekend was insane, and then the second weekend, it got even higher. It hit like 800 and... It was just under 900,000 players, I think, was the player peak. And that's crazy to get close to even 1 million. But I think this is the kind of game where the word of mouth spreads and you start to see people talking about it. And it not being on Game Pass likely helped it because it was then getting good review scores. Okay, so if you go to the top paid list now, you can see that it's also up at the top. Now, in some regions, it's in the number 1 spot. Now, obviously, I'm in the US, so it's really hard to beat Call of Duty. Now, funny enough, Call of Duty had the first 2 spots the other day when I checked it. So this thing here, the Vault Edition, was up here. Both these Baldur's Gate editions have now surpassed it. So the only thing standing in their way from the number 1 spot in the US is Call of Duty, which is, again, that's virtually impossible to a certain extent to overcome Call of Duty in the West. It's also not really fair because there's a big sale going on right now with Call of Duty. And if you go to buy the game, you can actually check review scores on the website. You just scroll down here and you click reviews, and you can see here it's got a 4.2. Now, that's not as strong as we're seeing Baldur's Gate 3's reception elsewhere. Okay, that's a lower score than it currently has on Steam and PlayStation. And that, I believe we are hearing, is related to a bug. So this has nothing to do with the Xbox community or the performance of the game. There was a bug bug that was like wiping saves, and so the score got hurt significantly. You'll notice that there's a ton of 5s, almost nothing in between, and these 1s down here, almost all of these 1s which are bringing the score down are related to that save bug thing. So Baldur's Gate 3 doing incredibly well on the Xbox platform while saying no to Game Pass, which could be informative to other publishers and developers if their game is big and in demand, but it could also be informative to Xbox going forward to think differently about some of the property and some of the deals that they might draw up. They may be looking at this and saying, we don't need to put everything on Game Pass, especially if it's not even our own property. So would love to know what you think about Baldur's Gate 3, how it all went down opening weekend to now, how it sort of took that week to ramp up with word of mouth. These videos typically roll over into a members-only debrief. So if you're not a member, you can click join for $5 a month. You get into a bunch of extra content. That's on top of my live streams and my uploads. So if you're not going to do the membership, make sure you hit that like button. That helps me out. Then hit subscribe and the bell button, and I'll see you in the next video.